Welcome to everyone. Thank you very much for being here. Just by way of introduction, my name is Jan Worthington. I'm a USM professional based in the United States, just outside of New York City. And whether you are in IT or operations or HR or finance or healthcare, higher ed, there's something all service provider organizations have in common, even if we rarely talk about it explicitly. And that is that every organization has a critical path. Now, to be clear, when I say critical path, I'm not talking about project scheduling. I'm talking about the service management path that every incident, request, and change has to move through to become value. Now, what's interesting is not that this path exists, it has to exist. What's interesting is that in most enterprises, no one actually owns it. Teams own tools, practices own procedures, vendors encode workflows, and governance tries to coordinate it all. But the path itself, the logic of how work is allowed to move across the enterprise, is usually implicit, fragmented, or assumed. So when I say critical path today, I don't mean a project plan. I mean the chain of things that must succeed before value can begin. And when flow breaks, it's rarely because people aren't skilled or committed. It's because the enterprise lacks a shared architecture for how work should move. Now today we're going to unpack that. Hi Craig, glad you could join us. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at what the critical path really is, why it sits beneath many of the challenges we experience with flow, trust, and scale, and how organizations are beginning to take control of it without adding more complexity. So what I'd like to do is split this into three parts. First, let's define what I mean by a critical path for service management, why most enterprises don't own it, and the hidden costs that this creates when flow is broken. Second, we'll look at how the Unified Service Management Method, or USM method for short, provides a universal architecture for flow, and how what I refer to as practice integration is different than trying to align processes. I'll also talk briefly about a dual lens approach that the Nonprofit Service Foundation is working on. And third, I'll talk about why this is so important today and how a few customers have leveraged USM to address these and other concerns. Now I'm going to open it up for Q&A at the end, and so we'll get a chance to talk. For now, if you have questions, I would ask you, I would beg you, please put your questions in chat. There's no such thing as a bad questions. And if I don't get to them today, you have my word, I will answer every single question that we get in as much detail as I can after the webinar. I'll also make sure and give you a link to the replay or to the recording. All right, so let's start by understanding what I'm calling service management's critical path. And if you see me pausing, I'm admitting people as we go here. So when I say critical path, I'm not talking about a project plan. Like I said, projects are temporary. Services are ongoing. In service management, the critical path isn't a timeline. It's the logic that keeps work flowing coherently. Now, by coherence, we mean that work behaves the same way every time, regardless of team, tool, or provider. And that consistency is what makes trust possible. So from a service management perspective, the critical path is the minimum architecture of trust between a customer and a provider. The USM method's 5 processes reflect this universal logic, and they form the backbone that every service relies on. We agree on what matters and set expectations and commitments. We change together when the service or its conditions must evolve. We operate to deliver what was agreed. We recover together when something is disrupted. We improve by managing risks and learning from what happens. Now, what's important to understand is this. Every relationship runs on a critical path, a minimal sequence of expectations, actions, corrections, and improvements that allow people to work together without chaos. As people come to understand USM's 5 processes, it becomes clear that all service work flows through these simple universal paths. They're universal, they're not domain specific, and they are always present. So the unified service management processes enable service management's critical path, the stable architecture for all services and all providers. And when I say all services, I'm not just limiting it to IT services, any service. The USM workflows use this process model to travel across the architecture to handle any service interaction. The USM process model enables 8 standard interaction patterns. You can call them generic value streams if you like, and they apply to any and all services. Each process uses context-specific procedures. These procedures are implemented using practices selected locally by the teams doing the work. So it's important to recognize that the critical path reflects a single architecture that makes every workflow coherent. Everything fits together, follows the same logic, and works as a unified system, regardless of how workflows are locally adapted. Now, I want to reassure all of us of something. In USM, work always flows through one critical workflow path based on one of the 8 universal patterns. That path is the backbone of the method. It shows how a customer interaction becomes a service outcome, whether that outcome is a change, a fix, or an improvement. What it does not mean is that all work must happen sequentially. Some internal activities, such as updates, records, or learning, can happen in parallel as long as they're completed properly. This key point is that the critical path in USM is always customer relevant and it always stays the same. Teams don't change the path. They get smarter about how they execute within it. And this is why practice frameworks really matter. They provide the expertise and techniques teams use locally, but they emerge within a shared management system, not instead of one. Now, the truth is, in most organizations, no one really owns the critical path. Workflow tools define flows in many places. Practice frameworks promote their own, quote, best practice workflows. Different business units, often guided by different frameworks, become protective of how work gets done, and governance tries to patch it all together. As the pace of business increases, the teams doing the work adapt just to keep moving. Now, over time, those adaptations harden into local practices. And without a unified management system, they really become workarounds. Gradually, the enterprise management systems and its flows are shaped by these competing forces. Tools govern daily behavior, vendors define the rules, and practices compete for primacy. Teams end up fighting over control instead of improving flow. The result is that flow is shaped by external logic, not by enterprise design. So the critical path we've been talking about gets defined by vendors, governed by tools, and contested across teams, rather than intentionally owned. Now here's another place where service management's critical path often gets confused. Every individual service has its own critical path, and it should. That path reflects how value is created for a specific customer in a specific domain. For example, HR onboarding has a very real end-to-end flow. paperwork, equipment, accounts, training, orientation, right? That flow should be optimized because that's what the customer experiences. Clinical appointment scheduling is different. The steps, constraints, risks, and even what counts as a good outcome are completely different. And this is where many organizations get tripped up. Because we focus so much on optimizing service-specific customer journeys, we quietly ignore the flow that sits underneath all of them. The service management flow. How any service is agreed, delivered, recovered, changed, and improved should be universal. That flow is stable. Services change. Domains vary. Customer journeys differ. But the logic of service management does not. If we don't separate these two, every domain ends up reinventing not just its services, but its management system. And that's where complexity and fragmentation begin. Most organizations accidentally optimize the domain flow, not the management flow. And this is why scaling breaks. The truth is, practices define their own logic. Each one becomes a kind of mini operating system, and over time your management architecture becomes fragmented by design. Gaps, overlaps, and conflicting flows are inevitable. Now, I'm not saying that frameworks like ITIL, COBIT, DevOps, SAFe, HR playbooks, or audit practices aren't needed. They all describe useful content for different contexts, but they're written at the practice level. Each defines its own workflows, roles, terminology, and success conditions. So when you plug multiple practices together, you don't get one coherent critical path. You get a patchwork of overlapping and conflicting flows. Flow becomes dependent on individual practice maturity and negotiation, not on a shared architecture. Now, of course, on top of practice complexity, we add tools. Service management tools, HR platforms, ERP systems, workflow engines, spreadsheets, low-code apps, and many more. Each one brings its own workflow engine and its own way of encoding logic. If the enterprise doesn't own the underlying management architecture, the tool will happily define it for you. And at that point, governance is left trying to stitch together fundamentally different models. But integrating tools is not the same as sharing an architecture. A tool encodes a logic, not necessarily your logic. This is where complexity and fragmentation start to compound. When tools define flow, governance becomes an afterthought. And this shows up as inconsistent experiences, interruptions to flow, and political friction between teams. It also leads to vendor misalignment and hidden rework. But I think the greatest hidden cost is really this. It erodes trust and social capital across the enterprise. People don't just lose faith in processes, they lose faith in each other. And that's the social capital story I explore in The Last Hill. And it's directly tied to whether or not an organization shares a common critical path. So everything we've described so far exists whether we manage it or not. Now let's look at the USM method and how it brings structure to this. The Unified Service Management Method, or USM, makes service management's critical path explicit. It provides a non-proprietary, non-redundant, universal architecture for service management across the entire enterprise and even across complex service supply chains. USM doesn't tell HR how to design onboarding, IT how to configure a firewall, or finance how to approve an invoice. But it does tell the enterprise how any service must be agreed, changed, delivered, recovered, and improved. And it does this in a deliberately simple way. 8 generic workflows are triggered by wishes, requests, incidents, RFCs, and risks. Everything else is domain-specific implementation. USM doesn't give you more rules. It gives you one set of rules that everyone can use. In doing so, USM establishes a unified management system for all services and all providers. USM's universal generic nature makes it well suited for today's complex service supply chains. Modern enterprises run nested multi-team, multi-provider flows. USM keeps those flows coherent under a single architecture. And this is how you scale without multiplying complexity. If we view every enterprise as a chain of providers, the real question becomes, do they share the same architecture? Unless they do, coherence is impossible. And when I say coherence, I mean the entire chain of providers follows the same architecture. Not the same tool, not the same method, not the same practice. The same logic for how work flows. When every provider uses a shared architecture, services connect. When they don't, everything disconnects. Think of it this way, right after the holidays, right? You buy a kid a toy for Christmas that requires assembly. Your wife starts reading the manual. You pull up a YouTube video, and your child just starts putting the thing together right away. And 4 hours later, after too many eggnogs, some rising frustration, and a slow deterioration of family unity, the toy still isn't working, right? So it's hard to keep people on the same page when everyone's working from different pages. Now, I wrote about this on LinkedIn some time ago. Enterprises tend to inherit multiple incompatible process models, each with their own logic. Governance then becomes a translation exercise between practice frameworks, rather than a way of establishing a shared way of working. There's no common architectural logic across the enterprise. When that happens, local routines emerge to fill the gaps. And these aren't really workarounds. They're people quietly reinventing the management system just to keep work moving. And that's what I've been referring to in this series as the difference between aligning processes and true integration of practice frameworks. Process alignment tries to reconcile differences after the fact. Practice integration starts with a shared management architecture. True practice integration is different. USM provides one universal process model that the entire enterprise can use. One logically repeatable structure for specifying all services. 5 universal service management processes, and 8 standard workflows that cover every pattern of service management for any service in any domain. Practices then integrate at the procedural level, and tools are implemented using one shared logic across domains. Teams are still free to localize how they work, adapting routines to their specific context. What changes is where integration happens. The USM management system integrates practice frameworks at the process level, the level of the critical path. Without this unifying management system, organizations focus on process alignment rather than true practice integration, and fragmentation is the result. Now, to really make sense of dozens of services delivered by multiple providers inside and outside the enterprise, 2 perspectives are essential. Obviously, one is the customer's perspective, and the other is the provider's perspective. And this is what USM refers to as the dual lens. The outside-in lens focuses on what the customer wants and needs, value, experience, and outcomes. It shapes agreements, priorities, and expectations. The inside-out lens focuses on flow and execution, how work actually moves and gets done. And this is where context-specific procedures and work instructions live. Both lenses are required, and importantly, neither one changes the USM architecture. The lenses change what we improve, not how the system works. Each lens can draw from established methods and frameworks. USM provides the structure, practices provide the content, and this avoids the chaos of process alignment. The outside-in lens asks, are we creating the right value? Are we doing the right things? The inside-out lens asks, are we creating value in the right way? Are we doing things right? Together, the two lenses provide actionable insight without disrupting flow. Improvement becomes systematic rather than reactive, and the architecture becomes self-reinforcing through feedback. If we focus only on outside in without inside out, we create beautiful designs we can't reliably deliver. If we focus only inside out without outside in, we create very efficient work that doesn't matter to customers. With both lenses, USM's architecture becomes a learning system. And that's how the dual lens brings the USM method to life, transforming a stable architecture into a dynamic capability for today's enterprise. This is how enterprises regain control of flow across complex service supply chains. One architecture, continuously coherent. That coherence comes from the structure provided by the USM architecture, combined with the two perspectives of the dual lens, outside in and inside out. This isn't just how organizations regain control of flow. It's also how they rebuild trust. Digital friction drains social capital, and most organizations really don't realize how much they've already spent. So with that foundation in place, let's take a look at why this matters today, who's using the USM method, and what you can do next. Just to summarize, the Unified Service Management method gives you a way to create and sustain a universal, unified service management architecture. One definition of a service, 5 processes, and 8 workflows. That architecture is essential. But by itself, it doesn't tell you where to improve. Flow can break for different reasons, because of gaps in customer value or because of gaps in internal execution. Understanding which is which requires 2 complementary perspectives, the customer's perspective and the provider's perspective. So I believe the timing for USM really couldn't be more urgent. First of all, AI and automation can't succeed on top of chaos. They require consistent structures to act on. As Gartner has observed, without standardized processes, automation simply accelerates existing problems rather than fixing them. Second, modern enterprises now operate in multi-provider ecosystems, cloud services, software as a service platforms, strategic partners. Without a shared way of managing services, organizations inherit contractual and operational complexity that's extremely difficult to control. As Forrester has pointed out, a unifying service management model becomes essential in these environments. And third, compliance and security depend on clarity, on clear, repeatable ways of agreeing, operating, recovering, changing, and improving services. Without a stable management architecture, assurance becomes fragmented and reactive. And finally, I think if you're serious about enterprise service management, you really need one management architecture that all services can share, not an IT-centric process framework stretched beyond its original design limits. Most industry analysts agree that enterprise service management only succeeds when multiple service teams adopt a unified operating structure. That's exactly what the USM method provides. So let me walk you through a couple examples of organizations that took an architectural approach seriously. Now, these are different industries and different histories, but they have, I think, the same underlying problem. Fragmentation was costing them far more than they realized. One of the most compelling transformations comes from the Netherlands, which, not surprisingly, is where USM originated. Its impact has been significant enough that USM is now part of the national reference architecture. Before USM, their situation was summed up in a single line: 2 cultures, 2 vocabularies, 2 definitions of service. Once they adopted a single management architecture, everything downstream became simpler: services, handoffs, automation, and governance. And what changed wasn't effort. What changed was structure. At Infozorg, one of the first things they recognized was that everyone handled work differently. As Iona Pons put it, in the past, every person had their own way of handling things. We depended too much on individual habits. Now that's what ambiguity looks like in service delivery. Unclear service definitions, inconsistent execution, and reliance on personal routines and heroics. What changed with USM wasn't a new tool, and it wasn't a new set of practices. What changed was the introduction of a single, shared management architecture. Once services were clearly specified, and everyone followed the same logic for how work flows, collaboration improved, knowledge sharing increased, and the organization moved from everyone does it their own way to we all follow the same architecture. That's the shift from ambiguity to clarity. And it's what happens when providers align to the critical path. All right, here's one more example. This time from DNA, which is part of the Telenor group. Before USM, they faced challenges I think many of you will recognize: inconsistent SLAs and OLAs, uneven execution across teams, slow procurement, and constant friction between departments. In other words, ambiguity here wasn't just a service problem, it was a business problem. Once they clarified how their services were actually built using one shared management architecture, everything changed. And as Mr. Salo, I don't know if I pronounced that right, but if that's how you pronounce it, what he says is, we widened our offering in value-added services since we clarified how our services are built. With architectural clarity in place, DNA accelerated procurement, streamlined contracting, reduced rework, and improved operational consistency. But the real breakthrough came next. Once the architecture was clear, innovation became possible. That's the shift from ambiguity to clarity. You don't just fix today's pain, you unlock tomorrow's opportunities. So here's what you can do next. First of all, learn the architecture. Understand the architecture. You can start by exploring the USM Wiki. It's free and it's a great way to get oriented around the method. Now, what organizations consistently tell us, though, is that while training investment in USM is pretty modest, success requires a few people that really understand the architecture. Now, the USM Foundation class provides the complete picture in just a couple of days. The second thing that you really need to do is build an internal USM capability. Just identify a small group, maybe 2 or 3 people, who can become USM professionals inside your organization. These are the people who are going to anchor the architecture and keep it coherent as you move forward. Third, pilot USM in just one service area. Choose a single service. Doesn't matter. IT, HR, student services, facilities, finance, whatever. Use USM to simplify and unify how that service is managed. And finally, scale based on evidence. Use the dual lens approach to understand both customer value and internal capability, and let that evidence guide you where to go next. Right? If we're in service management, we kind of know that already, right? From there, expanding USM across the enterprise becomes straightforward. If you own the architecture, you own the flow, and if you own the flow, you own the outcomes. Start small, prove the impact in 30 to 60 days, and scale with confidence. One more thing before we transition to Q&A. USM and USM Foundation and USM Professional Training are both available in North America. I think they're priced extremely reasonable, especially compared to most large framework training. We also are able to offer open workshops, or if it makes sense, we can tailor these workshops for a corporate audience, a specific audience or organization. So if the session sparked ideas about improving your service ecosystem, or about helping your team speak the same language and truly owning your critical path, I think sometimes those workshops are a useful starting point. That said, for most organizations, the USM Foundation and then the USM Professional is probably the most natural next step. Now, one quick note, I need to get this in. My book I just released, The Last Hill, explores the same theme, but from a much more personal angle, about how communities and organizations gradually lose coherence, how social capital erodes, and what it takes to rebuild a shared path. The critical path we've been talking about today is the structural counterpart to that story, the architecture that allows people to actually walk that shared path together inside an enterprise. Flow is deeply human. Every breakdown in flow consumes social capital. Architecture shapes behavior and relationships. Every improvement in flow is an improvement in human experience. Every breakdown in flow is a breakdown in social capital. That's why coherence matters. All right, so I know we may have a lot of questions, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the recording on. I'm going to put my video on. If I can figure out how to do that. Where did I go? Video on. Here it is. Let's take a look. You guys can help me out. You guys can see the chat too, right? So I'm gonna scroll down the chat here, and we'll just get into a conversation, and we'll take as long as you need.